beautiful, as ever. Life is beautiful. So please go back to your seats. In the meantime, just a few words of introduction to introduce the collective assemble. Jane Hall and James Binding are representing the collective today. After the young Equatorian rebels from Alborde who came in 2013, after the Belgian collective Rotor came here in 2015, the Global Awards is rewarding this year an even younger team, the collective assemble. Very young team of young graduates. Assemble was created in London in 2010 by about 15 Cambridge students. They were getting a little bit bored in their studies. They were a bit bored also in some of the agencies where some of them were already working, as most architects start, junior architects learning the ropes. Assemble then did a lot by way of social and cultural repairs in disadvantaged areas, in some gaps in the modern ruins of London and other cities in the UK. These are actions that they launch of their own accord, investing a place to give it a new use with the participation of local residents to rehabilitate the venue and give it life. Then there were a number of associations and groups that asked them for further interventions. And they did this in a participatory and community fashion. Assemble gives us a different face of London, or shows us a different face of London. We all get the feeling that it's a wonderful world metropolis with wonderful project sites, a real festival of architecture. But the action of the collective assemble students, still students, shows us that this boom, this urban and economic boom, has been digging some more inequalities in the city and has probably worsened the situation. And it shows that even in London, there are some students who can get bored in architecture agencies where this globalized architecture is being shaped. The members of Collective Assemble did not all graduate from the school, but some of them teach, sometimes in the best possible schools. And I would like to now conclude this very short introduction by raising a question which is of relevance to the young alternative French scene that knows Assemble very well. What is the future of Assemble? And this is a young alternative European scene that wants to get out of the beaten path to renew with a cultural and social role in the community. We want to find a model of development, a social model. This is a question that Assemble is asking itself, and we would like to ask them what kind of role they can play. And I would like to quote their answer. They say, "We don't know what the future holds in store for us." You didn't say so, somebody else did. But we always wonder how we can grow as a project. Because for us, you said, Assemble is first and foremost a project. Over to you, Jane and James Binning.
Hello. Hi. Hi. I'm Jane, and this is James, and we are only two of a collective of 20 people, mostly based in London, but also in several other cities in the UK. I'm sort of going to begin with this image that we made a couple of years ago as a way of representing ourselves. The idea being that what sort of brought us together originally and something that really underlines our practice is a real interest in making and how things are put together. And so this photograph, in a way, is supposed to emulate the kind of iconic images of the Amish barn raisers, where whole communities come together to create structures that are not only civic ones, but domestic ones. And it's a real kind of visible community activity. In reality, this is how our practice began. That's James and me in the corner. I would say that actually most of us have an architectural training, and we were all in practice, but we kind of felt like we could be doing more, and that our skills as recently graduated students were not quite the ones that were being best used in more formal practice, that we still felt we had a lot of experimentation and there was more fun to be had that could enrich the experience we were having behind a computer screen. I'm going to kind of go through like a whole selection of projects just so you can kind of get an idea of the sort of range of things that we do. I think what's good to keep in mind through this is that for a vast majority of these projects, we've built them ourselves. And always, this is a really good one, always try and find an element of making in the process. So we've done small-scale furniture. James actually single-handedly made most of those chairs. Exhibitions, this one's about Lina Bobardi, the Brazilian architect. And we're quite interested in collaborations and research. So this was a project called The Brutalist Playground with an artist called Simon Terrell, reimagining forgotten spaces of concrete utopias in foam. A lot of our projects seek out collaboration, and the initial ones definitely started from this kind of have a very performative aspect to them. Through all of them, there's very much a sort of public act of building where the project itself is built in the place in which it's going to kind of it's going to inhabit. We also build buildings, and so this is our soon to be completed art gallery at Goldsmiths University in South London, where the concept is to create a kind of dig out from a listed water baths, a number of kind of extraordinary, characterful spaces that don't kind of pander to the white cube model, but try and create something that's challenging for young fine artists to really engage with, and create something that, again, has this element of sort of performativity to it. I'm going to talk through our first project, the Cineroleum, as a way to kind of frame how our interest in our practice sort of originated from trying to reconceive how there are other roles for architects, how our relationship to a project could be maybe different. And I think what's good to keep in mind is this idea that we didn't know what those roles might be when we began. So the Cineroleum was the transformation of a petrol station in central London into a cinema. And it really began with a kind of real economy of means. All of the materials were mostly sponsored or very cheap. So we have all of the seats made from scaffolding boards and the curtain made from Tyvek. And it kind of hosted films for 5 weeks in the summer of 2010. And there was kind of a whole performance to it, right? So this building, this site was sort of overlooked and abandoned, and we sort of brought it back to life by kind of reversing the kind of activity of going to the cinema, which we saw as a sociable activity, which increasingly was being kind of sanitized by commercial cinemas. And so the idea is you're sitting there watching the film, and as the credits roll, the curtain goes up and you're released into the street. You become the spectacle with people on the street looking in and watching you. And to a certain extent, for me anyway, the project stopped when we showed our first film. Because for a whole month beforehand, the activity and the spectacle was about making the cinema, which was done in situ in front of one of the busiest roads in central London by a team of volunteers and other craftsmen who we invited to site to help us work out how to make it. And so it became about organizing ourselves around what was kind of a simple, stripped down idea of cinema, to be able to collectively create something with autonomy within the building site. So people took on roles which they gravitated towards. We had various different lines of production, from the production of the chairs to making the curtain. This was 3 kilometers of sewing that had to be done, and then eyeletting, and all of the tests were made on site. to create this kind of extraordinary transformation. And I think we sort of really began thinking about how personally developing a real interest in materials and how materials can be elevated beyond maybe their initial use. And this project is interesting because we did this great thing and it was really fun, but this is what the petrol station returned to afterwards. That you can maybe change through a temporary inhabitation the perspective of a site and demonstrate its potential, but without maybe some sort of consistent or different approach, the physical infrastructure is likely to return to what it was before. And so this talk is really framed by us kind of presenting to you particular projects where we have created organizations and a kind of business infrastructure behind the projects themselves. So whilst I hope I've shown you a range of our work, the projects that follow are not necessarily explicitly architectural in their form.
So the first project I'm going to talk about was a new town square in New Addington, which is near Croydon, a sort of satellite town in South London. And we took up this job after a public competition, a kind of call for ideas for how to revitalise a very kind of underused town sort of civic space in the centre of this town. So it was used kind of, you can see the kind of very poor materially. It was very kind of municipal, but very sort of run down and underinvested in. I don't think there'd been kind of much investment from the local council or government for sort of 20 years. And so consequently, there was this real cynicism about the project from the very beginning. When it was kind of announced that there would be a relatively modest budget, it was around €500,000 to kind of look at this town square and some sort of adjacent spaces. A lot of people felt like it wasn't really what was needed, or certainly like the services of architects to kind of make pretty this town square wasn't really what was required at all. More recently, the High Street had during a kind of period of riots in London, some of the shops had been burned down, employment rates were very low. So there were these real sort of acute social issues that many people felt were kind of being overlooked in favour of something which was kind of a quick fix to sort of make pretty this make a photogenic kind of space in the centre of the town and just move on and forget about Addington for a period of time again. So in the 1930s, Addington was sort of established as a kind of an area to sort of resettle a population from East London after the war, and it was kind of imagined as this radial plan, only a sort of part of which, a sort of slice, was only ever completed. So you had the kind of town centre over here, and then all of these houses kind of radiating out from it. And the transport infrastructure that was supposed to link it to the kind of main sort of London at large, or even Croydon, this kind of adjacent larger town, was never really put in. So until like the mid-80s, other than one sort of bus route, there was really very poor connections. And so subsequently, it kind of always felt quite cut off. And we really sort of began the project by taking the premise of the commission, which was looking at this kind of the only civic space in the community, really, and interrogating the brief, I suppose, kind of sort of questioning some of the logic. The brief was split into two parts, one which was for the kind of capital investment, so the money to be spent on physical improvements to the square, and then a pot of money at the end, which would set off lots of fireworks and celebrate how fantastic this set of physical improvements had been. And we said to sort of get people interested in the project to begin with, to sort of give us enough material to work with, sort of formulate a more robust brief. We needed to spend most of this money at the start to kind of get people excited, engage people in a dialogue about the space, and to sort of believe or to cultivate the idea that it could be used for some of the civic activities that were going on behind closed doors, which was also really evident. You know, a lot of people we spoke to when we first got there would say things like, well, nothing happens in New Addington, you know, nothing ever happens here, we're sort of forgotten, there's nothing good going on. And we put together this very simple piece of work, pretty unglamorous piece of work, which just documented all the things which were going on. They just weren't very visible. So all around the town square, there were kind of adult learning classes, things for the elder people, sort of dances, and all these very sort of civic-minded or community-focused events that were totally underrepresented. So the first thing that we did when we got the competition, or really the centre of the competition pitch, was to say that we'd have this series of activities to kind of celebrate and bring out into the public space all of these things which were kind of previously hidden. This sort of indicated the strategy, so there was a kind of focus. We'd work out of this building for the first 3 months of the design process, so we'd be there not only in kind of formal consultations in the evening or once a week to sort of update people on the drawings, but we'd sit in here, people could come, we'd make them some tea, eat some biscuits with them, hear them moan, hear their good ideas, sit through their bad ideas, and kind of gradually sort of filter all of those things. But an idea that rather than a sort of self-selecting group of people that were particularly interested in the project, if somebody only had 10 minutes, they could walk past on the way to the tram, drop in, and tell us that they thought what we were doing was a waste of time, or that it was a really great thing, and that all of these other things we should think about. So it was just this idea of making ourselves available by being in residence during this first period. And then this over here is this kind of area which the works would be concentrated in. So you can see this kind of little street which sort of connects this square, which was used mainly as a car park. It's the thing we saw in the first image, to the shops over here. And then most of the kind of housing and civic facilities over here. And so we began this kind of dialogue. I guess we started, and we were very interested in how we would take the approach that we used in the earlier projects that Jane talked about, of kind of opening up the construction process to a more general audience or the public, a way of kind of using making as a way of engaging people in kind of not only the act of building, but an idea that they could, that was a way of sort of empowering them to understand how they might affect change in their immediate situation, even if only at a small scale. And I think in this kind of context particularly, it was a very difficult dialogue to have with most residents about the role that we might sort of play as architects, or even to convince anyone that any of our design ideas on their terms had any merit, or even to focus, to understand that design might be a prompt for different kinds of activities to happen in the square. And there was a lot of resistance when we first presented drawings like this, that this wasn't the kind of thing they needed. It was they needed more security, more CCTV, which was a really difficult thing to kind of move beyond. And so what we proposed doing was to sort of not present any more drawings and just build the set of things that we thought might initiate a different set of activities in the square, in a very kind of crude way, using temporary theatre staging and things like that, and then set up all of the events that we kind of documented in the first stage of the project from that timetable, and put the heaters in or set up the power to enable those things to kind of come outside and happen in the square, and sort of prove to people or sort of show people or suggest that actually the square might be, it might be possible to kind of imagine the square as a place where some of these civic activities might happen, rather than just behind closed doors. And then, so this was a kind of a kids' dance at Christmas time. This all had to happen in the middle of winter with a very quick program, so it wasn't the ideal time of year for bringing people outside and having these kind of activities. But those really then formed the basis of an argument for the value of some of these quite simple, quite practical measures, really. So an idea of creating a focal point in the square that wasn't the kind of redundant metal benches that were there before, that were very easy for the kind of younger people in the area to territorialise and make the square feel quite intimidating. It was just a sort of simple stage with these two trees poking through, and copying the kind of herringbone floor pattern from the village hall that was really well used. So kind of simple material and kind of character reference to something which was one of the most valued kind of civic spaces there already. And turning one of the soakaways, so basically a big drain, into something that could be kind of skatable or used in quite a robust way. So sort of the younger people and kids that like to use the square for sort of cycling or riding around on their scooters, rather than that being something which would break over time if they were doing it, to sort of cast it in concrete and make it much more resilient. And there was an idea in this project, we'd spent a lot of time talking to all of the people in these buildings around the square, and sort of working with them to enable them to come out into the square to sort of for this sort of series of test activities, I guess. And we sort of convinced ourselves that in doing all of that work, we hadn't really done anything, and they'd done it all themselves, and that we just kind of acted as designers and left behind this quite sort of simple legacy of physical spaces, and that when we went, all these kinds of patterns of use would continue. And that didn't really happen at all. I think there were immediately some of the kind of political tensions that we'd spent quite a long time kind of carefully resolving between different shop owners on the high street, for example, immediately returned. It's a simple thing as like who has the key for the power on the stage, and those kinds of things actually being very small things, but being very material barriers to other people being able to kind of use the space in the way that had been possible when we'd had a more kind of controlling influence, I suppose. And so understanding that, having put a lot of effort into the consideration of how we design this space for a particular kind of use, we hadn't put in anything that really enabled it to, that would enable the space to be kind of managed, or in the longer term to support the use of the space in the way that had been conceived. So immediately a lot of the effort that we put into the design felt kind of compromised. And had we kind of thought that from the start, then we probably should have designed it a bit differently. So there's a question about going forward, what our role should be, or where our responsibility ended. The commission for this ended. We don't have to go back as designers. But there was a sort of an interest, I suppose, in what our responsibility was in this situation. So this was just some final pictures of the space. Black Horse Workshop was the first time that we kind of set up an organisation alongside the design project to sort of support and to design both the space or to kind of come up with the idea for the space, but also put in an organisational infrastructure that would be able to support and sustain the culture that the space was supposed to envelop. In our own studio space in East London, as it was at the time, we've recently moved to a different space, but we spent sort of 2.5 years in East London, and that space is very much set up as something which allows the space to be shared by a number of different designers and makers. So we share it with kind of joiners and carpenters, metalworkers, ceramicists. And there's these shared spaces which allow for both sort of larger scale production, but also this kind of overlapping of different uses of the space for social occasions and those kinds of things. And that's been really critical to the way that we've been able to practice in the last 5 years, whether that's building kind of small scale tests and material kind of experiments, but also larger scale kind of prototypes and mock-ups, through to kind of extending the space to kind of grow that culture, just make more space for other people to kind of join and form part of the community of kind of fabricators and makers that we'd started to kind of build around us very consciously at our studio. So this was an extension that we did on a kind of vacant site right next door. This was it completed, so we're in the, all the new tenants got the kind of glamorous, very pretty shed. We were in this building, which had been sort of partially burned down a few years before. So it was set up with kind of our office here in the front and a big sort of shared space, which would open up for kind of events or exhibitions or just sometimes for parties that would spill out into the yard. And this space here, which was for sort of recent graduates from a building crafts college down the road who kind of bought lots of tools and machinery and things like that. And then this space, which had sort of 25 kind of artists and other kind of makers. So in total, a kind of community of about 50 odd people. And there's the idea of this kind of shared resource of tools, and machines, and access to the space. This is one of the carpenters' workshops. And I suppose alongside these things, which are very related to this, how we used our own space and kind of tried to grow a culture around it, there was also ideas that had developed through the first projects about how we could engage others in the act of building. It's something that we found not only to be extraordinarily valuable in terms of our kind of architectural practice, but also as like a social act. The building site as a space where I guess like normal hierarchies are subverted. It's less clear sort of who's in charge, And it can just be very kind of empowering for people that don't often have the opportunity to sort of shape their own environment, to be involved in something like a construction project, whether in a small way or a more substantial way. As this was a small project in kind of Hackney, with a very, very low budget that will only have a sort of 4 to 5 year lifespan. I'm just kind of gathering up the rubble on the site in bags, kind of rendering it with a lime render, and the rubble on site that can then just be kind of broken out and returned, so whatever building comes on in 5 years' time can take it over. And Black Horse Workshop was a project that we developed with a council in North London, which really aimed to try to, I guess, take some of these things that we developed both as a methodology in some of our building projects, but also take the kind of culture of our studio space at Sugar House and make that sort of more publicly available. So we imagine this as a kind of public library for knowledge about making, and a resource for kind of tools and sort of DIY skill for a very general audience, from the amateur all the way up to the professional. So with sort of professional kind of advice from technicians and a bench space that could be rented either on a daily basis or for kind of a week or a month or longer term membership. So it provided a fairly simple set of facilities for kind of woodwork and metalwork, a kind of wet room and things for finishing, but also this emphasis also on the social aspect, so the bakery and the cafe, somewhere which really just became a kind of a public building, part of the life of the local area, but which had a focus also on the social aspect of making. So in terms of its kind of physical space, it was very simple. It's kind of walls of pegboard and a very simple kind of colour scheme, really. It was done for a very, very low budget, so about 100,000 euros. And the space itself was just a conversion of a council-owned warehouse building that was fairly uninsulated. But really the idea was to try to create this space as somewhere which could kind of grow and over time really support this culture in the area. So whilst it had kind of 1 year's initial funding, part of the project was always going to be how it could sort of grow into the community, find an audience, and hopefully sort of find a way in which it could endure for a longer period of time and really sort of develop a community around itself. So in addition to kind of working on the built work as architects, we'd put together the business plan and sort of scoped out the project. And there was always an idea about the role that we would play in the project thereafter. So Black Horse Workshop was a space which we sort of wrote the job descriptions. We're involved with the hiring of the technicians to run the space and still sit on the board as board members. So we have a kind of involvement not only in the kind of design future, it's just been extended after a couple of years, so it's still sort of going already kind of beyond its original anticipated lifespan, and how we can sort of support that into the future. So this is just one of the kind of weekend classes, and that was the first time I think that we'd really kind of tried to take on a role which was beyond that of the architect and set ourselves up as part of the formal infrastructure that would be involved in the ongoing management of the space. And it's something that we've looked at doing a couple of other times since, and that's something that Jane's going to talk about now in relation to Dalmarnock.
So I think our kind of notion of participation, or the notion of community engagement and participation that perpetuates, is one where a community is consulted, does some nice drawings, and then is completely ignored. And I think what we sort of discovered is that what we understand to be interesting is creating spaces for communities and giving people the tools to kind of enact what they feel is appropriate and work out what our space is equally at the same time. And so Baltic Street Adventure Playground is a project that's kind of without building and sort of understands construction not being about making something physical, but about making a space for a community which maybe didn't identify as such as one because of the way in which it had been kind of overlooked, particularly by local government. So this is in Glasgow, in Scotland, in an area called Dalmarnock, where I think it's a huge proportion of children live below the poverty line. And so simple things like just having some shoes to go outside and play was the thing that was restricting people. And so our first act was to take this bit of land and to just clear it, to allow access, to allow it to become a usable, safe space. And this project came to us via, it was an art award. And it felt kind of grossly inappropriate to be making public art in a place where people barely kind of have the facility to even leave their houses, even have a winter coat. And so we helped set up the organization to set up the playground, to hire the play workers, to train them, to work with them, to go and knock door to door to get children out to play. And as James said in relation to Black Horse, we sit on the board of the playground still, and members of Assemble are kind of in Glasgow regularly. We also did some soft landscaping. And these playgrounds are really based on the idea of the Berlin playgrounds that were kind of begun in the late 80s, where the idea is that construction is the play, that you can learn through construction, that young people are given responsibility through things like communally making and being around fire, which is a really important trope of these spaces, and that this is not dangerous. This is a lesson. This is a part of education. And we did a whole load of interviews with play workers kind of in many places around the world since, recording their kind of thoughts about this approach. And one of them has this amazing line where he says, "All of our knives were blunt, so we sharpened them. And children cut themselves, but they only cut themselves once." So the idea is that these children who are kind of undervalued in society are kind of given tools in order to not just create their own space, but also try and kind of see value in the place that they're in. So Baltic Street Adventure Playground has essentially one rule, which is you can do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't stop anyone else from doing what they want to do. And the way this project is sustained is by the play worker, Robbie, who's there kind of fighting for it, and we've stayed in a kind of support mechanism. And in a way, this sort of relates to our biggest kind of project in the office, which has been with us for kind of 4 years or so, called Granby 4 Streets in Liverpool. And this really began with a kind of, in very similar circumstances, in that there was a kind of community that had been hugely overlooked by a sort of 90s New Labour government who had systematically allowed the area to fall into decline. And we were invited to come and try and work with residents to kind of develop a new vision for these 4 streets in this area called Toxteth in Liverpool. And what struck us most, and I think anyone who visits this area of Liverpool, is its rich history, which is really rooted in struggle. The race riots, the 80s, it's got one of the largest kind of Black and Asian populations in the UK. And people really felt like formal systems of governance, formal systems of development had really let them down. This is the condition of the majority of the houses that we had to work with. Yet, at the same time, there was still a huge sense of community. And in a way, this was where it really became evident that the visible acts of making an inhabitation are a form of protest, are a form of activism. So the local residents who still lived in amongst a lot of abandoned houses, you can see a lot of them are boarded up here, but people were planting their streets and saying, "We care, we're here and we care." And we got to know this group of residents who'd formed a community land trust, which is an association that they owned a set of 10 houses in this area, and the value of the land is separated from the value of the house. So the land remains in ownership of the trust, but the house can be sold on, and so the value of the property always stays in control of the local community. And we started to kind of really get inspired by how rich the community that we saw was there, despite the fact that the local area and the way in which this area of Liverpool has been stigmatized was kind of otherwise trying to say a kind of converse narrative. And so these are just a few examples. And, they still had such great humor, like writing, don't bump into this wall because the local council were like accidentally knocking things down. And, it became this kind of battle, which was just sort of lived out through this kind of exchange. And so our approach was to really take advantage of how much these houses had fallen into a state of disrepair. So instead of kind of trying to pretend that these were going to be, they had very, very little budget. A lot of the work was going to be done in kind by contractors, which meant we had very little control over what that would be. And so the idea is to try and minimize construction. And so you can see in the top rooms, maybe where a ceiling had fallen down, you don't rebuild it, but take advantage of this kind of new space, which is in a way not what these terrace houses were designed to be like, but yet could offer maybe spaces that might fit a kind of different type of community or different cultures of communities that were now living in these houses, which were once made for people, working class labourers, and are now occupied by, kind of a Muslim family or young couples or lots of different types of arrangement. And so this is one of the spaces. And in a way, we found that our job here became quite formal. Our relationship to the community, whilst it was, kind of really probably unusual in its intensity and how involved we were with being there, the job itself was to refurbish some terraced houses with very limited means. And in a way, this project felt like there was something lacking in our ethos, something that as a collective we hadn't really maybe involved this idea of process and methodology that we'd so kind of worked really hard to kind of build up and develop. And so James is going to talk about how we tried to change that.
So I suppose in the earlier project that we showed with the kind of colourful facade, which is an extension to our studio building, there was an idea there that if we build everything in 95% of the project is very kind of economical and expedient and just sort of super practical. That had been kind of a timber frame with all the section sizes considered so that we could sort of handle them and assemble them ourselves. It was built from one kind of Kingspan panel system. So it was very, very, very cheap, really kind of mundane detailing in its kind of practicality. And then it had this one element, really, which is this kind of billboard-like facade, which gave status to the activities that were going on within. So 95% of the budget was spent extremely practically and 5% on this kind of one element that kind of elevated the building into something different. And it was a similar logic with the houses in Liverpool. They had to be built to a very, very simple specification so that local contractors could do them at extremely competitive prices. I think it was €70,000 about that each house had to be kind of reconstructed for. And so once you have this very simple shell, there was the question, and ultimately the residents that were there had sort of fought for 20 years to get something better than they had been offered by the council or by other developers. So it wasn't enough after all that time to just hand over some sort of simple, reasonably fitted out shells. And so this idea of kind of 95% of the house being very expedient and very practical, and kind of making the most of the spatial opportunities of, say, a room, without a roof, or kind of leaving a space double height, was kind of added to by this set of kind of objects, which aim to restore some of the kind of richness and character, or just show the care that the original Victorian interiors so evidently had, and that were kind of visible in the houses that were still lived in by the residents that we'd met. So this is an example of a kind of cast concrete fireplace that was made by going around the backyards of the houses and kind of collecting up these bits of demolition rubble, the kind of broken slats from that had fallen off roofs, or bits of brick, and crushing them up and binding them together to make these mantelpieces, which were kind of formed the symbolic hearts of the homes, I suppose. And these were kind of built in a kind of factory terrace, so turning one of the houses that was in very poor condition into a kind of temporary workspace, which meant that these things were kind of being sort of built on site. That kind of activity was very visible, and this transformation was again one which was quite public. We sort of set up a market stall with these to kind of talk about what was going on and show some of the smaller kind of products made with the waste materials and things, and to sort of communicate what we were trying to do, what the ambition was with the project in the refurbishment of these houses. And that extended to a kind of range of objects through the house that you sort of experience. So really very simple pieces of joinery in all the kind of cabinets and cupboards in the kitchens and in the living room and in the bedrooms, kind of embellished with these very simple ceramic knobs, or the kind of 10p tiles, so completely standard kind of white tile, builder's white tile, that were kind of kind of amended or kind of added to with a very simple kind of process. These are kind of ceramic decals, which are used by sort of ceramicists and things like that to create quite graphic patterns. So something which can be quite kind of random and done very kind of quickly and cheaply to create a kind of difference and variety in otherwise very straightforward and repetitive processes like tiling or kind of press molding these tiles. So there's this real idea of how we could turn one of the houses into a site of production, use it as a way of kind of developing a new layer of kind of material kind of care, developing this kind of product line for this first set of houses, which would sort of enrich them and push them beyond what would otherwise have been delivered as fairly standard houses. So this activity took place in the kind of the backyards, and really sort of looking at processes and the way in which we could use the materials that were around us, and the processes that we were familiar with. Again, still as like relatively unskilled people. Jane sort of hinted at it in the conversation about the cinema project that we built first, but really each project treating those things in our own kind of a balance, a sort of a degree of skill, but not being skilled in any of these particular kind of crafts, as a way of bridging, I guess, between the expert craftsman and the complete amateur. So these processes as things which are set up with a level of intelligence and understanding that you need to make lots of them, and you need to make them to a kind of fairly consistent standard, but always allowing for chance, so that somebody who comes on site can pick up this technique fairly quickly and understand that they can kind of they can vary the amounts and kinds of aggregates in the mixture, or they can add different kind of pigments and things to the concrete. So they start to understand how they can have an agency, even in a very small way, in a simple and structured process. This is another example in the kind of ceramic knobs which were just fired in a barbecue. So you could take whatever you had for lunch, your sort of spent coffee grains or your tea bags or your banana skins, and all the different kind of chemical compounds that are in those, you throw them in the barbecue with these ceramic knobs, and you get all these kind of different finishes, the different kind of glazes. So this was the workshop space which was kind of set up kind of more formally, I suppose. So at this point there was, well actually if I jump back a couple of slides. So around this kind of time, the project was noticed in the UK as, or was kind of nominated for an art prize, a big art prize in the UK called the Turner. And with that came a huge amount of scrutiny on the project, huge amount of kind of public and press attention. And there was a bit of discomfort or kind of uncertainty about how that related to our role in the project. You know, we'd really been working on it for a year with this community. in Liverpool, and it wasn't really our story to tell. You know, they'd been involved in the kind of regeneration of this area on their own terms for 20 years. And it was really a recognition of that kind of background and that narrative which gave our project any kind of merit at all. Otherwise, it's just the fairly typical refurbishment of a group of houses in the first instance. So there was an idea that kind of trying to find a way of channeling that press attention and using it in the longer term to support more formally the culture of creativity that was really evident in the way that the residents had begun to kind of reclaim their streets, kind of paint their houses, and really kind of take ownership and responsibility for their own neighbourhood. So we decided to set up Granby Workshop as a kind of small space to begin with that would produce prototype products for the display and sale during the Turner Prize exhibition. So that we'd use the kind of platform of the gallery, which was going to be in Glasgow, and all the sort of media attention that would come with that event to try to launch a business in the local area that could kind of support the culture of creativity that had been so kind of key, really, to the residents, affecting over a long period of time the transformation of the area on their own terms. And that was a very simple space with kind of wooden racking and all of these things and lots of kind of prototypes. This was, experiments with kind of cardboard lights, so the idea of like how you can make something very cheap that'd be flat packed and sent out, through to slightly more kind of laborious or strange processes. So this was using kind of a silicon gun to make piped plaster ceiling roses, so something quite typical of kind of typical Victorian detail. Taking kind of standard components from the builder's workshop and trying to embellish them with a different finish, and also working with people with more skill, like this ceramicist, to create these kind of sort of stained and pressed terracotta products, so kind of lampshades. So taking the idea from the original enrichment of the houses and trying to sort of scale that up to make something which, to create this kind of fuller range of products for sale. So there were these stained terracotta lampshades and this kind of steel frame chair with some block printed kind of fabrics, taking very simple kind of materials and using a marbling technique to apply them to sort of cement boards and kind of other industrial materials. Again, this kind of range of ceramic knobs that were kind of fired in the kiln. And these were all displayed alongside things like the mantelpieces, all the kind of experiments, the successes and the failures in this showroom as part that formed kind of part of the gallery exhibition. So you go through all the kind of the white spaces in the contemporary art, and you'd arrive in the kind of shell house of this Victorian terrace at the end. And there was kind of information about the project. So not only the kind of the products themselves and the architectural project, but the sort of the backstory. And that was kind of something which was put together with a number of the residents who kind of wrote their stories, wrote their kind of essentially gave them a platform to kind of describe the project on their own terms, and for people to understand our relationship kind of to it. As people that had arrived at a relatively kind of late stage in the process, but maybe enabled through quite a particular or specialist skill as designers for it to move to a different stage. So this was the workshop team. That project, obviously, the Turner Prize was a couple of years ago now. So that was sort of the launch pad for this business. But it now, it's kind of moved premises again. It's still in the local area, and it's been able to kind of invest and gradually sort of build up resources in a similar way to the way that our studio is set up, and it employs a couple of local young people that work alongside us in the space. And the work in Liverpool is very much ongoing. So we're involved in the ongoing management of both the workshop space and kind of a number of other projects, and considering the way in which like all of these things can start to sort of play a role and enable a kind of, not only the formal kind of physical infrastructure of the houses to play a part in the rebuilding of that kind of community and that kind of gradual rehabilitation of the neighbourhood, but how other bits of kind of more social or organisational infrastructure like Granby Workshop can also enable that to kind of happen, and gradually over time that our role can sort of wind back, and they can take ownership of those structures for themselves and use them kind of as they see fit. So those are the three projects that we wanted to talk about today. I guess less of a focus on the architectural work in and of itself, and more about the different ways in which we've kind of tried to kind of take and sustain a role and an involvement in the projects and the physical things that we've kind of put out there. And yeah, hopefully that sort of raises some kind of interesting questions about like where our role as designers might kind of be seen to end, and how in the future we might think about kind of other expanded ideas and boundaries for our role and responsibility within the work that we're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.